All right, so this video is going to get on a little later, as you've noticed, than normal. Normally I'd like to have it uploaded by the time I was starting to record this, but when we got to Goodfellas, they had an end of the year football party, as some of your friends might have told you, so the review session didn't get started till a little later. So it was also kind of loud there, so I wasn't able to record the review session, so I'm basically doing two review sessions. One is for the people that are watching right now, and then the other one was for the people that actually came to Goodfellas. So lesson learned, call the place and make sure there's not a kid party there first. So I'm going to kind of look at the computer monitor a little bit over here, and then I'll also be looking at the test and different review sheets that I've given you right here as well to kind of give you ideas about what's going to be on the test. Remember, anytime you're going to study for a test, material for the test is going to come from both lecture and also from the book. So some of the stuff, it might just be something that I mention in class that's not actually in the book, and that actually is not written down in the notes, but if you're paying attention, I kind of emphasize it. Generally speaking, I don't do that much, but if you pay attention, you should understand what things are going to be on the test from that section. So, like I said the other day in class, the test is going to be 65 questions Scantron, as well as you're going to have a bank of 6 essay questions to choose from. For the essay questions, one of the essay questions has to do with explaining a nerve impulse, a basic nerve impulse called an action potential. That's in the chapter 6 notes. I did take some time to explain that. If you downloaded it and listened to the clips that I explained, it's in there. Another one of the essay questions has to do with the different divisions of the nervous system. So if you think of, you've got the nervous system as a whole, right? And then there's two main branches to that, or there's two branches to that. You have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. There's also branches of the peripheral nervous system as well. Check that graphic out, study that a little bit. That would help you to understand what's going to be on the test for that portion. In addition to that, you also have an essay question about stages of sleep. We talked about that in class. It's in the book. It's also in the notes, kind of what happens in different stages, what they found out about different stages. It's a little bit more specific than that, but if you understand that, you should be able to answer that question. There's a question that asks you to take a position in the nature-nurture debate. So it gives you a quote, and then it asks you to state whether you agree or disagree with that quote. So that's one of the essay questions. Also, you have an essay question that asks you about something that's almost directly related to the lab, or not to the lab, excuse me, the discussions. So if you look at the discussions, you should be okay. If you paid attention for that, did what you could, made sure that you knew what was going on, you should be totally fine for that part. Then there's also an essay question about dreaming, something to do with dreaming, okay? So if you look at the review sheet, notice there's 3 columns. The left-hand column has stuff from chapter 6, the middle column has stuff from chapter 7, and then the right column has stuff from chapter 8. All of that stuff in some form or fashion is on the test. Sometimes it might just be where there's a question that has 2 of those things in the answer bank and you have to be able to distinguish those. It might not necessarily be the right answer, but if you know everything on the sheet, that would get you probably 80 to 90% of the test. So use this to focus your efforts. Don't use it as just the only thing that you're going to study. So let's start out, and let's start with the left-hand column for the review sheet from chapter 6. Where it talks about an action potential, a central nervous system, peripheral system, etc. One important thing to keep in mind with action potentials, that's a nerve impulse, okay? So when a neuron fires, it operates under something that's called the all or none law, which basically states that either a nerve cell is going to fire or it's not going to. So there's going to be an impulse or there's not. It doesn't mean that, let's say you feel something that's 100 degrees and you feel something that's 110 degrees, the sensation you experience of an increase in temperature does not come from a neuron firing harder. Where that comes from is there's more neurons involved, maybe deeper neurons are involved in that sensation process, or they're firing more. The level, the number of times that they fire increases. It's not that they get stronger, okay? Also, when we talk about the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, the central nervous system is your brain, including the brain stem, and then the spinal cord. All of that collectively refers to the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is everything else. So all of the neurons, nerve cells, nerves that go through my hands so that I can feel stuff, that go into my face, everything else other than the brain, brainstem, spinal cord, that's the peripheral nervous system. So you can subdivide these into branches. There's a graphic that explains this fairly well. The peripheral nervous system can be subdivided into branches, the autonomic and somatic nervous system, and then you can subdivide the autonomic nervous system into two sub-branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So check those out. In short, basically the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches, those again are part of the autonomic branch. Autonomic is automatic stuff. Somatic is the branch that you can choose to do stuff. So right now, my autonomic nervous system is functioning to keep my heart rate going, keep my respiration going. I'm not really thinking about that, it just happens. My somatic nervous system is functioning and allowing me to talk to you, allowing me to wave my hands, look at the screen, move my toes, whatever, stuff that I'm doing willfully, that's the somatic nervous system controlling those things. What the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic branch does, the parasympathetic branch functions to slow stuff down. The sympathetic branch functions to speed stuff up. So if right now I'm sitting in my basement and I hear something slam upstairs really loud, I would assume that my cat probably is getting into something, but my heart rate would rise a little bit. When I went upstairs and noticed that it is in fact my cat, not somebody breaking into my house, my parasympathetic nervous system would be kicking in, trying to keep everything kind of in balance. When I first hear the loud noise, the sympathetic branch is really kicking in to speed things up. So again, in short, it's a little bit more complex than this, but the sympathetic branch speeds stuff up, parasympathetic branch slows stuff down. Also know, there's not a lot in terms of like this part does this in the brain, this part does this in the brain on this test. There are some of those things. So for example, the outer mesh of nerves and outer mesh of parts to the brain, like the immediate outer shell, that's called the cerebral cortex. That can be divided into 4 different sections that are referred to as lobes. The way that you test activity in the brain, the cerebral cortex specifically and other parts, is you can do a couple of different types of scans. An EEG, which measures electronic activity in the brain, you don't need to remember what each thing means. So for example, an MRI stands for something like magnetic resonance imaging. You don't need to know that that's what it means. You just need to know that it's a method of studying the brain. Same thing with an EEG. And a CAT scan is another type of those methods to study the brain. They all kind of show different things, but they all serve a purpose. Okay, we also talked about, it's in the notes when I discussed this, but afferent neurons and efferent neurons, and then interneurons. So if, let's say, I touch something that's hot, the signal that comes into my body through the peripheral nervous system travels along what are called afferent neurons, afferent with an A. When it gets into my brain or my spinal cord, because some reflexes are actually carried out in the spinal cord, they actually don't go all the way to the brain in some instances. But when those things are being transmitted, when my central nervous system is telling me to move my hand away, the neurons that carry out that action are called interneurons. And then the neurons that send out the message to my hand to pull it away, those are called efferent neurons. So afferent neurons are through the peripheral nervous system, they come in. Interneurons is the processing neurons. Efferent neurons are sent out telling you what to do. Another concept, if you look in the category, it talks about dendrites in the left-hand column. Dendrites are the connections that get built between neurons. So if you look at somebody's brain physically, you do a very detailed scan of somebody's brain that has some certain mental disorders, like Alzheimer's. The level of dendrites that they have is like really a lot less than somebody that's younger and that's healthy. And that's another defining characteristic when you look at people that are elderly. Compare that level of dendrites that they have versus somebody that is younger. At some point, not with all elderly people, so it's not like once you reach the retirement age then you lose all your dendrites. It's a gradual process. But if you look at somebody that's like 100, the level of dendrites that they'd have versus somebody that's 30 would be much less. So biologically, the thing that makes you smarter when you're trying to study something, when you're learning how to do something, that's growing more dendrites. If you watch the clip, it talked about the corpus callosum, so I'm not going to talk about that too much. That's pretty straightforward. In the notes, it talks about something called centralized and cephalized. That's referring to the nervous system. So the nervous system is centralized in that it's centrally located. It's in the middle of your body. If I cut myself in half, like right here, directly down the middle, through my brain, through my spinal cord, everything, I'm going to have half the neurons that I have on one side and half on the other. It's almost an even split identically, unless you had some damage or something to a certain side of your brain. So centralized means in the middle. Cephalized means focused towards the top, okay? So like towards the brain, in the upper part of your body. So when we have our nervous system, it's both centralized, it's in the middle, and it's cephalized, it's focused in the brain. Nature versus nurture debate, we've talked about that a lot before. Nature is the biology, nurture is the environment, what you're taught, how you learn stuff. Where it says parts of the brain and parts of the cell, that's referring to a section of this test where it's Scantron, but you have to identify what different parts are for the brain and then also for the cell. And then if you continue down in the column, it talks about somatic and autonomic branches. I just discussed those. That should be pretty straightforward. The endocrine system is the system that sends chemical messages around the body via the method of hormones. So when your body releases certain hormones, those hormones tell certain organs to do certain things. Those messages collectively are sent out through a system that's called the endocrine system. If you look at chapter 7, it talks about altered states of consciousness, hypnosis, biofeedback, meditation, sleeping and dreaming, and then also drugs would be the general examples of altered states of consciousness. So if you look at sleep, we talked about sleep before. REM sleep stands for rapid eye movement. That's the stage of sleep where most dreaming occurs. If you look at people that like sleepwalk, that actually happens in most instances in stage 4. Another thing you should be aware of is the different types of drugs. So there's a few questions that say alcohol is an example of what? And then you would say a depressant, right? There's a question that says something like, which of the following is an example of a hallucinogen? And you would say marijuana or LSD, etc. So know the difference between stimulants, depressants, hallucinogens, etc. For sleep disorders, we primarily talked about 2. Sleep apnea was one, and then narcolepsy was the other. So sleep apnea is where you actually stop breathing while you're sleeping. It causes you to wake up. Narcolepsy is the one where you'll just fall straight into REM sleep from being awake. If you continue on and you look at like perspectives of dreaming, there was a slide in the notes that talked about that. If you study that, it should be pretty straightforward. So for example, the Freudian perspective, remember that always refers to the subconscious. Freud would say that dreams function to reveal something to us about the subconscious. There's also something in here that talks about how drugs work. And in effect, between a cell, between 2 cells, there's a gap. Cells don't actually touch each other. Neurons don't actually touch each other. That gap is called a synapse. So the way that messages get sent between neurons is through a series of chemicals that are known as neurotransmitters. Drugs, depending on the type of drug, alter those neurotransmitters in a certain manner. So if it's something that causes you to see something that's not really there, hallucination, that is working by mimicking neurotransmitters that would help you to see stuff. If it's something that is telling your body to speed up, that would be like a stimulant. That drug is mimicking those neurotransmitters that tells your body to speed up. Okay, and then chapter 8 talks about sensory adaptation, sensation and perception. Again, in short summary, sensation is what you experience from the environment. Perception is something that the meaning you construct out of that thing. In the lab we did in class, we talked about just noticeable difference, Weber's law, and absolute threshold. So know what those concepts are. That should be pretty straightforward. In your eye, remember that there are a couple different examples of types of cells that are used to see stuff, rods and cones. So know which one is better at certain thing, or which one is used for certain things. So rods primarily, obviously they're shaped like rods. They're used to see black and white in motion primarily. Also know some stuff about the cues of perception, depth perception that we talked about, like figure ground perception, how that works with speaking. If you're in a theater and there's a whole bunch of people speaking before the movie and some random dude says, "Hey Bill, hey Susie," and you hear that over everything else, the voice is the figure, the ground is the noise in the background. Also know the 4 primary examples of the sense of taste. And that's kind of it in a nutshell. I went fairly quickly, but I did cover almost everything to kind of give you an idea to focus. In terms of the format for the test again, about 40 questions that are multiple choice. You've got about 10 that are matching where it's actual concepts, like hallucinogens, different types of meditation, hypnosis, different sleep disorders. Then there's the section that asks you to identify parts of the cell and then also parts of the brain. There's 15 of those total, so like 6 or 7 for the cell and then 8 or 9 for the brain. There's some questions again about what types of drugs do, and that should be pretty much it. So again, think of what the discussions were about for the essay. That'll help you on some of the essay. Again, you've got 6 essays to choose from. You only pick one. You only pick